a study that was recently done on that particular technique, which actually showed that we can actually get the same gains with much less time by doing this type of strategy.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Movement and Performance Podcast, where my goal is to guide individuals in taking an informed approach to fitness. Today I have with me Guillermo Escalante. Dr. Escalante is a professor of kinesiology at California State University. He also performs research in the areas of human performance and physique enhancement. But my favorite part, he's a bodybuilder himself, as well as a coach for bodybuilders. Today we'll be discussing advanced techniques for muscle building. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Yeah, thank you for being here with me today. We got to meet at the NSCA conference where you were talking about advanced techniques for hypertrophy. And, I immediately thought I have to get you on for a podcast episode. I had an episode previously on hypertrophy and muscle building. And, most of what I'm talking about on my podcast is for general population. However, there are a lot of people that tune in that have been lifting for some time, and I think the advanced techniques could be very valuable for them to hear, and maybe even a little selfish for myself, some of it as well. So thank you for being on, and let's start off with just talking about what makes muscle grow. So we're going to keep it super simple first, and then we'll dive into the advanced techniques.
Yeah, awesome. So just like big picture overview for what makes muscles grow. And we basically break it down to muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. And at the end of the day, we basically have to have a situation, create an environment where muscle protein synthesis is greater than muscle protein breakdown, creating that positive nitrogen balance, which then is going to enable the muscle to grow over time. Now, how do we navigate increasing muscle protein synthesis? So there's a two-prong approach that I like to say, probably a few more, but to keep it basic, number one, I think adequate calories and adequate nutrients are very important. So we have to feed the body. We have to have enough calories in general to be able to grow. So being in an energy or out of an energy deficit is definitely an ideal environment to grow. And then within that, we have to make sure that we feed the body enough protein. And then what is enough protein? Research indicates that a minimum of 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight seems to be kind of an ideal minimum number to not leave any gains on the table. But the range typically goes from 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And I like to err on the side of caution as a little insurance policy. So I usually like to prescribe that 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight as a starting point. And then because taking more protein, it's not going to necessarily be detrimental. Now, if you take too much, you're probably not going to be able to get enough other foods and micronutrients. But 2.2 grams seems to be kind of a good sweet spot for me, which breaks down to about one gram per pound of body weight. So I always say, whatever you weigh, consume that in grams of protein per day. Whatever you weigh in pounds, consume that in grams of protein per day, and that'll give you a good starting point. So enough calories, enough protein. Then from the training perspective, we want to basically, when we're in the weight room, I know Brad Schoenfeld wrote a great paper back in 2010 talking about the three main components in which muscles grow, which was basically mechanotransduction, muscle damage, and then the last one, which is the metabolic type of component to it. But realistically, what we've seen over the last several years, there's been a lot of research in this area. We see that mechanotransduction is kind of like the primary mechanism that drives muscle hypertrophy. And that's basically created by creating mechanical tension in the muscle. So we have to make sure that we're overloading the muscle enough so that we're creating that mechanical tension. And then that's going to lead to ignite certain pathways in the body to increase muscle protein synthesis. So weight training alone will increase muscle protein synthesis, particularly if you're loading that muscle. But it's going to be enhanced more whenever you feed the body with enough calories and enough protein, because muscle protein breakdown will also increase during weight training as well. To help kind of negate that, the food component will help to create that muscle protein balance in the right direction to help maximize muscle protein synthesis.
Love it. That was an awesome summary. Quick point on protein. It seems like a lot, right? So when the average person hears that, it's like, wow, okay, I have to consume a lot. Do you recommend that people just get it from food, or protein shakes and protein bars are super efficient to make that happen?
Yes, I definitely recommend a food first approach, but I don't recommend a food only approach. So as you said, like I weigh close to 200 pounds. So to get 200 grams of protein on, purely chicken breast and egg whites, that can be done, but it can be a little bit tedious. So I usually do, 1 or 2 shakes a day to kind of help supplement that. So I would say 70-ish%, 80% of my food, my protein from my food, and then the other 20 or 30% will come from a supplement type of source.
Awesome. By the way, I could see your bicep bulging out. I love that you're practicing what you preach. But so talking about the piece with, you said mechanical tension is one of the most important ones. Am I right with that? So can we dive into mechanical tension a little more? Does that specifically mean lifting heavier weight? Does that mean coming close to failure? What is, when someone is in the gym, the average person, what would that mean to them?
Yeah, so this is actually a cool area of research over the last few years. We used to think that we had to lift, fairly heavy all the time so that would be intensity to be able to make the muscle grow. Now that's important for strength for sure. Like you're not going to get stronger lifting lighter weights. You have to put some weight on there, but you can actually build muscle using lighter weights as long as you're going to failure or near failure. That being said, there's kind of a pragmatic approach. I'm going to say a more practical approach, which is why most bodybuilders typically train in the 6 to 12 or 8 to 15 repetition maximum range. So the weight is heavy, but they're not doing 3 or 4 reps. They're doing heavy enough where they're basically failing or reaching close to failure in that 6 to 15, 8 to 15 repetition maximum range. But of course, there have been some studies done over the last few years where we actually look at doing repetitions of 20, 30, 40 reps. So you're talking loads of 30% of your 1 repetition maximum, 40% of your 1 repetition maximum, even 20% of your 1 repetition maximum. And they actually have found muscle hypertrophy. But of course, the one caveat to that is if you're using only 30% of your 1 rep max, you're probably going to need to do 30, 40, 50 reps. That's a long time and it's extremely painful. And the other thing, and it's boring to me. And then more importantly, I'm going to say that most people, because of the fatigue factor, they're going to typically stop well shy of failure because it gets cardiovascularly taxing. You get the muscles burning. So very typically, people are going to kind of tap out before they really reach true failure. So I have found that typically the reason bodybuilders typically train in that 6 to 15 repetition range is because it's kind of a good compromise between intensity and heavy, but not doing a 2 or 3 rep max, right? And also being able to reach failure in an adequate amount of time. So if you're going to hit failure or near failure in 8, 9, 10 reps, that's a lot more feasible. And you're probably going to be close to reaching failure if you're loading correctly, rather than trying to do 20% of your 1RM for 40 or 50 reps.
And would you say that volume plays a component? So, I could be coming close to failure, but if I do that once a week versus twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week, is volume a big part of this equation as well?
Yeah, you kind of have to have a good compromise within them. Obviously, if you're training to failure on every set, you're probably not going to be able to do as much volume because you're gonna have to take some time to recover. Which is why kind of, again, a lot of bodybuilders, they don't necessarily train to failure on every set, but they're going to train within 2 or 3 repetitions close to failure. And then they're going to kind of make up some of that difference by doing some extra volume. And most of the literature today, suggests that adequate volume is typically about 10 to 20 sets per muscle group, is kind of a good sweet spot. And again, there's some individual variance with what that sweet spot is. So I always like to tell people, use that as a general guideline, and start low and then build up from there, because there's been studies now where they've examined sets of 30 sets, 40 sets, 50 sets per muscle group, which is just super high volume. And there is a dose response relationship with volume. So in other words, 2 sets is better than 1, 3 sets is better than 2. And then it kind of gets to a point where, is 20 really better than 10? Well, sometimes, yes, there's a point of diminishing returns at what point in time. So the gains start to kind of plateau. And not only that, but to be able to physically do say a 40 sets per muscle group, per week, week in and week out, that's not necessarily going to be very sustainable. And you're probably going to set yourself up for injury at some point in time. So 10 to 20 sets per week is a good point. And then again, you can determine what volume works for you depending on the load that you're using, and then whether you're going to failure or near failure. So if personally for me, and for a lot of the people that when I used to coach, I'm not one to go to failure on a regular basis. So I prefer to do 2 or 3 reps shy of failure on most sets, and then taking a set to failure, periodically, maybe every few weeks, so you can kind of really gauge where you are. And because of that, you can actually afford to do a little bit more volume, rather than doing, only 10 sets or 8 sets per muscle group. And then of course, spreading out that volume throughout the week is also a good way to do it. So like lagging body parts, I usually try to recommend you doing those maybe over a 2 or 3 days per week with a day or 2 of rest between those training sessions.
Yeah, man, great points there. So you wouldn't necessarily say one is more important than the other. And I'm talking about training till failure or volume. They're both playing a role.
They're both playing a role, and it's kind of like it's almost like a gas and brake type of relationship, where one's going to play a role in the other, and then and how much gas you put is going to be dependent on how much brake. So you have to kind of teeter back and forth and find that sweet spot. And if you're going closer to failure or to failure, then your volume is probably going to have to err on the lower side. Or if you're going maybe 2 or 3 repetitions shy of failure, then your volume could probably err on the higher side. And so it's kind of a sweet balancing spot that you have to kind of experiment. Because again, this is why it's so important to understand that people are going to have individual responses to training. So you really have to use the literature as general guidelines, but ultimately you have to self-experiment with you to see what works best for you.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, and I'm diving into these components because all of them play a role in the advanced techniques that we're going to talk about. Like when I'm thinking about this myself, so another comparison is rest. Training till failure. Should I rest more? Which is more important? So for example, if I do short rest periods and I burn that muscle out, or should I do longer rest periods and be able to get in more volume and train more? So when we're talking about these components, it kind of lends itself into those advanced principles that we're going to get into. And I guess while we're on it, just to mention that one too, rest periods, I'm guessing it's going to be the same thing here. It's probably finding that sweet spot, not resting, too little, not resting too much, to be able to get enough volume, but also get some close to failure in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that's going to be dependent on, are we talking about a large muscle group like the quads and the glutes, or are we talking about a smaller muscle group like the biceps, right? Because those larger muscle groups are going to they're going to expend more energy. They're going to require a little bit more rest, whereas something like the biceps is going to require a little bit less rest. And then again, the literature kind of shows us that about 2 to 3 minutes of rest between sets kind of seems to be a good sweet spot. but you can get away with 1 to 2 minutes on some of the smaller muscle groups. And then there's a whole practical component to that as well, which is, how much time do you have? And, like if you're going to be resting 3 minutes per muscle group in between sets for a muscle group, I mean, now realistically, if your set takes you, say, 45 seconds, and then you're going to rest 3 minutes. So by the time you set up and everything, you're talking about 4 minutes per set. So
Right.
if you're going to do just 4 sets of one exercise, that's 16 minutes. I mean, that's a long time to do it. So now if you're gonna put that into, say, a total of 12 sets, that's only one muscle group that you did, and that's total of 48 minutes of just doing 12 sets of one muscle group at that rest period.
Yeah.
So it's not very practical sometimes, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost makes me think of a new word that's trending, I think, in the field is exercise snacks. But I wonder, it makes me think, like, if I have access to equipment, let's say I'm working from home and one of my rooms is a gym and the other room I have my computer and laptop, if just, every so often I go in there and hit a set, I wonder the difference between that versus an actual workout session that maybe lasts an hour.
That would be interesting to investigate, to see what would happen. So if you were to break up that workout, it may take an hour or maybe 45 minutes, but you break it up throughout the day sporadically versus doing 1 hour fully vested in that one muscle group. It would be interesting
Right.
to see that investigation.
Yeah. So let's start talking about some of the advanced practices. I tried to kind of categorize them into buckets, but there's so much overlap between these things when it comes to rest or volume, intensity. But I guess we'll kind of, do the best that we can. But the first bucket that I had was supersets. So what is a superset, and what are some examples of supersets?
Yeah, so supersets is a I'm going to say, like, the big overview word of a lot of these different types, because there's different types of supersets. But it's basically going from one exercise to another exercise, and with very little rest period between those exercises. One example of a superset, you could do what's called an agonist superset, which basically means you're working the same muscle group from one exercise to the next. So as an example of this, let's say if I'm doing a chest exercise, I could go from a compound chest movement to another compound chest movement. So that would be like a flat dumbbell bench press to an incline dumbbell bench press. It's two compound movements. I could also do what's called an isolation to a compound type of, which is called a pre-exhaust superset. So in this case, I would, using this chest as an example, it would be like doing a chest fly movement with a dumbbell or with cables, and then going into a compound chest press type movement, like an incline dumbbell press or a flat dumbbell press. And then that's known as a pre-fatigue. And the specific part of that is that you're basically going from an isolation movement to a compound movement. So that would be an example of an agonist superset pre-exhaust technique. You can also do what's called like an agonist antagonist superset, which is now working muscles that are opposing of each other. So one way to do this one would be, let's say you pair a chest press movement with a rowing type movement. So you have your agonist of your chest. Well, the antagonist of that's going to be your lats, essentially. So you're flexing and then you're extending the shoulder joint. So you would go from, let's say, a flat bench press, for example, and then you would rest, say, 1 minute, and then you would go into a rowing type movement. Let's say a barbell bent over row or a cable row, and then you do that set. And that's actually one of my favorite techniques because it's a great time saver. And actually, there was a study that was recently done on that particular technique, which actually showed that, hey, we can actually get the same gains with much less time by doing this type of strategy. And that's why I'm a big fan of it, because I'm a morning workout guy, and I have to get to work and I have to get started for my day. So for me, I can allot maybe 45 minutes to an hour in the morning, which doesn't give me a whole lot of time to really get a lot of lifting in. But this agonist antagonist supersets allows me to get adequate volume and intensity, because the way I like to do it is if I'm using that chest back example, I can do that chest press movement, then rest a full minute to kind of catch my breath, and then I go into a pulling movement. Then I do the pulling movement, and then I rest another minute. So by the time I get back to the chest press movement, I've
You
actually
rested enough.
rested about 2 or 3 minutes for my chest.
Mm,
And then I've had about a minute or so time to kind of catch my breath from my back workout. So really, it doesn't really sacrifice the quality of and my strength when I'm doing the movement.
mm.
So I can train at a good intensity, but I'm also saving a lot of time in between there.
I think I mentioned at the conference, but I'm a research assistant in Brad Schoenfeld's lab. So I was a part of that, a research assistant for that study. I wasn't, running it or anything, but I was helping support it, which is cool to see all of that stuff done firsthand. But so when I think supersets, I think of, you kind of already said it, but time efficiency. So they're a great tool for that, and you're still getting similar gains. When it comes to that pre-fatigue one, agonist, is that, what is that trying to accomplish, and is it actually accomplishing that? Like, is it effective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question with regards to that, because the theory for this is that if let's say we're doing that pre-exhaust technique. So let's say I'm going to use that chest fly technique. So I'm going to basically pre-fatigue my pecs.
Mm,
And by the time I get with a flying movement, and then by the time I get into the chest pressing movement, basically the theory is that I'm going to recruit more muscle fibers, because I've already recruited a ton of them, and then now they're already fatigued. So therefore, I'm going to have to recruit more muscle fibers to be able to do that chest pressing movement. However, the science actually hasn't really supported that. So that's the thought
mm.
process. And in fact, what we actually see in the literature is you actually have less activation of the muscle fibers. So they've actually done EMG studies. So when they do the chest fly, they do the chest fly, they look at the EMG, then they do the chest press, and then they keep the EMG on there, and then they realize that we actually have less activation of those particular fibers, which would kind of be counterintuitive. But interestingly, what they have found is if they do it on the triceps, when you pre-fatigue the chest muscles with a fly movement, when you go into the chest press movement, because your chest is tired and it's not recruiting as much, they
You'll
actually
recruit the
found
tricep
increased
more.
activation of the triceps. So
Right.
that could be a technique. Again, there hasn't been no long-term studies with any of this, but hypothetically, you could potentially end up enhancing growth of the triceps, because you pre-fatigue the chest that you're doing, and you're going to recruit more triceps in that chest press movement. That would
Mm.
be another interesting long-term study to see if that actually plays out. But I'm actually not a huge fan of the pre-fatigue agonist superset. I'll implement it once in a while. I will say one way I like to use it sometimes, if let's say I'm having a little bit of I don't want to lift as heavy because maybe I have my shoulders inflamed, maybe our rotator cuffs inflamed, then chest pressing movements can cause some pain when I go heavy. But then I can actually go and using lighter weight,
Mm.
and then I can maybe unload my tendon a little bit, because I don't have to push as heavy of a weight. So I have
Mm.
used them in that manner periodically.
Mm. So the feeling of fatigue doesn't always necessarily mean you're actually recruiting more. Because I would think that in that instance, you're going to feel a bit more of a burn, and whatever that is and whatever that means, right? So there's a message going to your brain telling you, that you feel this. But again, I guess that doesn't necessarily mean that it's recruiting more.
Exactly. And actually, and you're absolutely right. And there's actually a few studies that have actually shown indeed that when you're fatigued, you actually have less recruitment of the muscle, not more recruitment. So there's a couple of studies that have actually shown that fatigue actually decreases the recruitment of the muscle, not increases it. And the other thing that you add to that, which is another interesting component, is that second tier that may contribute to muscle growth, not as much as mechanotransduction, but it's that metabolic stress, because that metabolic stress, you're going to get more hydrogen ions released. You're gonna get a lot of blood to that tissue. So that metabolic stress, it could potentially create maybe some sarcoplasmic type of hypertrophy during that point in time. At least acutely, you'd be able to see that. Whether that translates in the long term, again, that's still to be determined.
Yeah, very interesting stuff there. I feel like I'm getting some ideas for studies in the future. But all right, so moving on to the next bucket I put there was volume. And again, there's so much overlap, so I don't want to classify these, but I guess just for the sake of conversation, it makes it easier to talk about. But I put in there trisets, giant sets, and German volume training. It just seems like there you're doing more, right? Like, what are you trying to do in that? Is it working? What do those protocols look like?
Yeah, so these are kind of I'm gonna say supersets, quote unquote, on steroids. We'll call them. So it would be agonist supersets on steroids, quote unquote. And what I mean by that is a triset would basically be you actually have 3 exercises that you're doing for the same muscle group. So using my chest as an example, you could start maybe with a flat dumbbell press. Then you go into a flat incline dumbbell press, and then you go into a cable fly for the chest. So you're doing 3 exercises back to back. And again, the principle's kind of the same there. It's going to be, you're going to increase the metabolic stress with there. Again, we're probably going to see some of the same things that we're probably going to get less recruitment over time as you get more fatigue. But whether that leads to more hypertrophy long term, we don't know. I will say that Mila Sarcev, who is a big time bodybuilder who's worked with a lot of other big time bodybuilders, this is one of his strategies that he uses. He uses trisets and the giant sets quite a bit in his training protocol. So he'll actually group 3, 4, sometimes even 5 exercises back to back of the same muscle group. And he's used that to some success. Again, I can't say that's anecdotal, but you do see there's a lot of anecdotes that show that, it works. Of course, there are other things involved with some of the people that he works with, one being that they're genetic freaks to begin with. So
Right.
I think almost anything would work with them. But nevertheless, we do see some of that. I think it's something that needs to be investigated further. But to the point of the giant sets is basically doing 4 or more exercises for the same muscle group. So if I was going to do legs as an example, I could pair, let's say, a leg extension followed with a leg press, followed with a lunge, followed with a squat, followed with let's say some sort of sissy squat. So now I've done 5 exercises back to back to back. So again, all of these are volume intensifying techniques. So you're basically going to be doing, because you're doing so many exercises. If you're doing 4 or 5 exercises and you're doing, say, 15 reps per exercise, now that set, quote unquote, becomes 60 repetitions that you're doing in that one particular giant set. So it is very much a ton of volume in a very short period of time. And again, you're going to get that metabolic stress for sure. You're going to get some of that potential sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. And again, there's something to be said that I think metabolic stress can lead to some growth. Again, maybe not as much as the mechanical tension, but I think it definitely is a contributor to muscle hypertrophy.
And then German volume training. I'll tell a quick story before that one, but my former professor was a gentleman, Pat Davidson. He's doing bodybuilding nowadays and making a name for himself for sure. But the first day I was invited to train with him, they were doing German volume training. This is back in the day. And like we would test everything out, anything new that seemed cool. It's like, let's give it a whirl. And I remember, because I was lifting before, but not lifting that much. I think that whole week I couldn't even pick a pencil up off of the floor. So German volume training is a whole nother beast.
It's intense. It's, that 10 sets of 10 with 1 minute rest. So again, it's a volume intensifying technique, right? So you're basically doing 100 reps. You typically using 65% of your 1 rep max. So it's heavy, but it's not super heavy, but it's heavy enough. And that first set doesn't seem too bad. Second and third set, you're still probably in the game okay. But by the time that fourth, fifth, sixth set, you start feeling the pain. And then by the time that seventh, eighth, ninth set rolls around, you're pretty much dying because your rest periods are so short at that point in time. And you get a lot of work done in a very short period of time, right? Because 10 reps will take you roughly, I don't know, 30, 40 seconds to complete, and then you rest a minute. So let's say you have a minute and a half times 10 sets. That's really not a lot of time. That's what, 15 minutes to do that particular exercise. And then, of course, the other thing you have to remember with the German volume training is that it's supposed to be, 1 or 2 exercises max that you would do. So you may do the squat, and then you follow it with like maybe an antagonist, with maybe an RDL, and then you technically should be done with your training session at that point in time, and then you come back, a day or two later, do something else.
So you mentioned trisets and giant sets, that there's potentially some merit there, but maybe the research isn't showing as much support. I would assume that German volume training might be hitting that limit of doing too much, right? Like 5 sets. You said there's this like plateau at a certain point. Maybe like we don't need to go past 5, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think German volume training, I mean, some of the research has shown it's really you'll definitely feel it, right? Because it's something that you're not used to, especially when you first start. But it's shown that it has been no more effective than traditional sets, of like 5 sets, 6 sets. So, and as a disclaimer, I'm going to say that actually most of the research to date on all of these types of advanced training techniques actually show that they're not necessarily worse than, for the most part, but they're not necessarily better than traditional strength training. But I like to strike this other caveat, is that when we look at the literature in all of these, it's like it hasn't really been done on highly trained athletes. It's been done on recreationally trained, maybe pseudo advanced trained, but really not elite athletes. So when you actually see that, we really haven't studied the population of like elite bodybuilders or elite strength trainers. Well, and when we're talking about hypertrophy, our target population should be elite bodybuilders, because that is their main goal, is for hypertrophy.
Right.
So we really haven't seen any of these studies done with these elite bodybuilder type of individuals. There's been a lot of them has been done in untrained people, because that's the easiest group to get, or recreationally trained individuals, which are, again, and not to say that the studies are invalid or they don't say anything. It's just, they are what they are. They all give us a small piece of the puzzle, and you can't infer the results into a highly trained population.
Right. Yeah, that's valid. I know a lot of the people that are being recruited are students a lot of times who are, and so definitely a valid point there. Another piece I wanted to mention, so then, like, I think about German volume training, and I couldn't pick a pencil up off the floor. Clearly, we were doing deadlifts. We did deadlifts, and I think we might have paired it with pull-up. I think it was upper body, lower body. And then we did, like, squat and overhead press. But either way, I was very sore. But soreness doesn't necessarily mean growth either, right? Or can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of goes back to that original paper that Brad wrote, talking about the 3 potential causes of muscle hypertrophy. And one of them was muscle damage, and muscle damage is related to soreness. Obviously we have found in a lot of these studies that, you don't necessarily need to have muscle damage for the muscles to grow. I will say, there may be a very, 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 very small contributing factor to it, but I think it's a marginal at best. And realistically, the reason we get sore is because it's a novel movement, a novel number of sets and intensity. So it could be, you maybe did a new exercise that you haven't done before. So you're going to feel that. So maybe you're used to doing squats and all of a sudden you start doing lunges. You're going to feel that. It could also be from the volume that you're doing, right? Like if you're used to doing 3 sets of 12, 4 sets of 12, and now all of a sudden you do German volume training where you're doing sets of 100 essentially, not sets. They're doing sets of 10, but you're doing 100 reps versus 36 reps or 48 reps. Well, you've just more than doubled your volume. So yeah, you're going to be sore. So those are some of the reasons why we get sore, but I think it's important to understand that soreness does not equate to muscle growth. And actually, once you've done a particular training program for a while, you really don't get sore. Like you'll probably feel a little bit like I worked out yesterday, but you're not to the point where you can't walk and you can't pick up a pencil as you stated in your experience.
Right. So it sounds like soreness is tied to novelty. I like that you said that. And then if you really think about it, the key to building muscle wouldn't be novelty. I have to do this again and again and again. And over time, a lot of times it's doing the same stuff doing the same stuff a lot is what is causing it. So it almost seems like it's, it just unrelated. And I'm sure there's some relation there, but to the point of, novelty is just saying that it's new, and something new is eventually you want this to not be new, and you want it to be something that your body is becoming very accustomed to.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up a great point there, because especially nowadays with social media craze, there's a lot of trainers out there putting content, and it's like, try this exercise, try that exercise, try that. And they have like a million variations of like these exercises. And sometimes I think people tend to major in the minors instead of just that, majoring in the majors. And at the end of the day, I think just focusing on exercises that work well for the individual, that it's not that they can progress over time, that they can master the technique over a period of time, and doing that and progressively overloading that is more important than constantly changing the exercise. So I'm not a big fan of changing exercises on a week-to-week, workout-to-workout basis. I actually stick very much to, the same plain vanilla exercises most of the time, particularly the ones that I'm really progressing. And then, I'll add a little variety for, maybe, so I'll pick maybe 3 exercises where I'm doing the same exercise, basically 2 or 3 of them. And then I may add 1 exercise where maybe I rotate that exercise every week or every other week, or depending on what's available. If I'm working in a different gym, right? You may have to make that adjustment, or what's available even in your gym. If you work out in a busy gym, you might have to, wait for a particular machine or just do a different exercise.
How often would you say that you do change it up then? Would you say maybe every 6? And I know you said maybe this whole week-to-week thing, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking more like a month, 3 months of doing the same routine, and then you maybe instead of doing, trisets, you do supersets, or maybe then another 3 months, it's the same exercises for the most part, but maybe you'll do a little less volume or a little more volume. Or how often do you switch that up?
Well, I'm gonna answer that in 2 parts. So first, the exercise itself, I don't change the exercise too much, but I do progress it over time, and then I kind of try to keep the same exercise in for maybe minimum, typically 4 or 5 weeks. I think that's the very minimum. Typically, it's going to be more like 8, 12, 16 weeks, at which point in time, either my body's feeling it, like I need something different, or I've reached a plateau. And I'll give you an example, like hack squats are amazing. I love hack squats. But after progressing hack squats for, 12 or 16 weeks in a row, my knees are going to tell me about it. They're going to feel it because I put a lot of tension on the tendon and on the quad, and then it's going to say, okay, so now I may need to maybe phase out the hack squats for a little while, and then switch to another type of squat type movement, whether it be a leg press or maybe a front squat or another type of squat pattern. And that being said, though, if I were to constantly change it from week to week, if I were to do hack squat one week, leg press the next week, front squat the next week, then I never really get to progress any of them, and I'm not really perfecting the technique. So I like to kind of see the progress on one exercise and then progress it for at least 4 weeks, and then write it out as long as I can before I kind of switch it up. The second part of your question was the advanced training techniques. And those I kind of just go by, it depends on which one, because sometimes I mix and match some of these. Like I said, I'm a big fan of the agonist antagonist supersets. So those are pretty much for my training, they're almost a staple where I regularly use them. Doesn't matter what body part I'm doing, I use that superset combo quite a bit. Or if I'm doing a full body workout, I may do an upper body, lower body type superset, but I may integrate and sprinkle other advanced training techniques on top of that. So maybe what I'll do is I'll do them in a cluster format, or maybe I'll do them in a myoreps format, which is like a form of a rest pause. Or maybe I'll do them in a drop set format. So I may sprinkle some of those other ones depending on, and some days I won't do any of them. I'll just do like traditional straight sets on that particular workout.
Right. Yeah, that brings up another point that I often see myself coming back to in this like variety versus specificity. And if you want to be really good at something, you have to be very specific and do that thing again and again. And then if you want to be healthy, you need to increase a little bit of variety. And again, it's finding this balance. Like you said, you could, hack away at the hack squat for 12 weeks. And then at a certain point, changing it up a bit, your body's going to tell you, and maybe switching it. But it's, again, finding that balance. Because when I think about advanced principles myself, I notice, I've been lifting for a while, and I'm not lifting in the realm of bodybuilder. I'm lifting more so for performance and health. But still, I've been lifting for a while, and I think my body has reached a plateau with some of those things. So going to advanced principles is valuable for me. And, doing something like a drop set, doing something like lengthened partials, that's my new one. That is a new buzz, and I've been working on a little bit. But every once in a while, dabbling in some of these advanced principles, I think has been very beneficial for me when I hit those plateaus. But so I just wanted to hit one or two other advanced techniques. And so I put this bucket as high intensity, maybe training close to failure. Again, there's so much overlap. How do you do it? But, and this one was drop sets, forced sets, and the eccentric loading.
Yeah, so the drop sets are, those are fairly easy, and this is like an old school bodybuilding staple that they've used for decades, which is basically you pick an exercise, and then you do a set to failure or near failure, and then with a very short rest period, it's basically just enough time to adjust the weight. You typically drop the weight anywhere from 10 to 20%, and then you do another set to failure or near failure. And that would be considered one drop set. And you can do 2 or 3, maybe even 4 drop sets where you continue to drop the weight by 10 or 20%, and then you go to failure or near failure. Typically, if when I implement these, so I use this as a volume intensifying technique for myself, and then and I don't do it every workout, but again, if I'm pressed for time, I may do I'll do 2 or 3 traditional sets with a adequate rest in between. So let's say I'm doing a leg extension. So I may do a leg extension, rest 90 seconds, another set, rest 90 seconds, another set, rest 90 seconds. And then on that set, I'll do the drop set So then I won't rest 90 seconds when I do that third set. After that third set, I'll rest just enough to change the pin. I'll drop 10 to 20% of the weight, go to failure or near failure, and then I may do 2 or 3 drops in that particular type of exercise. And then what I'm able to do is I'm able to increase the volume that I did in a very short period of time. So I'll do 2 or 3 traditional sets with 1 drop set, which again, it allows me to add more volume to the exercise in a relatively short period of time.
So it's more about volume for you than coming closer to failure.
Well, I think it's kind of both, because I get the volume and then I'm pushing to failure or near failure in those. So it's really kind of hitting both, which is what I like about it. I'm getting both check marks. So I'm getting the volume component and I'm going to failure or near failure, with every set.
So forced reps, you tell me if I get it right, but you're, the person is helping you and assisting you on those last couple ones that you wouldn't have gotten yourself. And then eccentric loading would be pretty much your lifting heavier than you actually would be able to and lowering it down slowly as opposed to the concentric action.
Yeah, so these are other two, and again, there's not a lot of strong evidence with either of these two that they work better than the traditional set. And same thing with the drop sets, by the way. The evidence right now with the drop sets show, hey, whether you do drop sets or traditional sets, as long as if volume is equated, you're going to get the same outcome. But that's actually one thing that I like to highlight. Bodybuilders do drop sets to increase the volume in a short period of time. So when scientists, I know why scientists do volume equated, it makes sense, but the purpose of doing it in a bodybuilding scenario is to increase the volume in a short period of time. So when you do volume equated, sure, you're able to get the volume in, but it's going to take you an extra, several extra minutes per exercise to be able to equate that volume. But if you do the drop set itself, you're saving a lot of that time. So that's the caveat for that. But the force reps, to your point, yeah. So you have you're going to be doing a load, let's say. So let's say I'm doing a bench press to keep the exercise easy with 315 pounds, and let's say that's my 10 repetition maximum. So at the 10th rep, I basically failed. So at that point in time, then I know I can't do 11 or 12 by myself, but I have my spotter there helping me. So he or she is going to help me get an extra few reps. So essentially, it's kind of like a drop set in that the difference is that you're relying on the spotter to kind of help you, get an extra few reps to there. And then you typically do anywhere from 1 to maybe 3 force reps in there. But one of the reasons I like to shy away from that one is there's a lot of reliance on a good spotter, number one, who knows what they're doing. And number two, the amount of weight that the spotter is helping you can vary, right? So how do you know if they're actually taking 10% of the load off, 20% of the load off? I've worked with spotters that get so excited when they're spotting that they may take 50% of the load off to the point where I'm not really doing much of the exercise. So,
right.
So there's a lot to be said for that one. And then the accentuated eccentric loading, as you said, it means, let's say I can do 315 pounds for let's say 315 pounds on the bench press is my 1 RM this time around. So instead of doing I would probably put on the bar maybe 325 pounds, 335 pounds. And then what would happen is the spotter I would lower it myself, and then the spotter would help me on the way up. Another way you could do this is on a machine by yourself. You could actually, if you're doing, let's say, a leg extension, you could actually load the weight where you're doing more weight than you can handle on one leg, and you lower it. So let's say my 6 RM is 110 pounds. So I would actually bump it up to maybe 130. So I would drop it with 130, with one leg, and then with my other leg, I would bring it up. So I'm going to get the help with the other leg, and then I slowly bring it down again with one leg, and then until I get my 6 reps, for example.
Awesome. So I had 2 more. We'll see if we get to them. Maybe it'll be just one of them. But the short rest, I put rest pause. What's a rest pause? Again, it seems like there's a common theme of these aren't necessarily better than traditional training, but are there any of them that we should say like, no, this is actually even worse than traditional training, just in case?
Yeah, for me, I would say the forced reps, I would probably say, is one that there's not a lot of good evidence for that, and there's high potential for injury, so that's probably one that I would not necessarily recommend with that. Same thing with the accentuated eccentric loading. For muscle hypertrophy, there's not enough evidence at this point in time to really say that that's necessarily better than. And again, you're loading a lot on that muscle, and potential for injury may rise because you are putting so much load. But to answer your question, the short rest period, the rest pause, typically what you would do with this is you would choose a number of reps that's higher than you can accomplish. So to give you an example, let's say I can do 100 pounds, and that's my 10 RM for this particular exercise. So what I would do is, if I know I'm going to fail at 10 reps, then what I would do is I'm going to say I'm going to do 15 reps with this 100 pounds. So I would basically get all my 10 reps done, and then I'm going to fail at 10 because that's my 10 RM. And then I would do a rest for, let's say, 5 to 10 seconds. And then I would do as many reps as I can. Maybe I get 3 done. And then I would rest another 5 or 10 seconds. Then I'd probably get 1 done, and then rest another 5 to 10 seconds. And then I'd finish the last one. And now I got the 15 reps. So that's the rest pause technique. The other way you can do it is the cluster set, which is a type of rest pause, but this is a little bit more prescriptive. So what I mean by that is you would do clusters. So instead of doing a traditional set of 12 repetitions, let's say, you would do it in clusters of 3 or 4 reps. So let's say you choose clusters of 3. So you would do 4 mini clusters of 3 reps. So you would do 3 reps, rest maybe 10 to 30 seconds. Then you do 3 more reps, rest 10 to 30 seconds until you get your 12. The advantage to that is you can actually load more weight on the bar typically, because if you're doing a 12 RM, you're going to have to use your 12 RM load. Let's say that may be 100 pounds. But if I'm only breaking it down in sets of 3 with a little bit of rest in between, I may be able to load 110 pounds because I'm only doing 3 at a time, right? So I'm going to be doing 3, then I rest 10 seconds, 3, rest 10 seconds. So it's a good way to increase the intensity by adding that short rest period.
Love it. All right, so as we slowly come to a close, I had one question. I don't know why it came to my head. I think I was listening to one of your other podcast episodes, and I wanted to ask a question on bodybuilders and short lifespan. Do you think that bodybuilders have a shorter lifespan than the average individual? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it depends on the bodybuilder that you're talking about, and I think when you're looking at enhanced bodybuilders, because they do push their body to the limit with other anabolic agents and other types of drugs typically. I think this is where we may see some of these differences come off, and a lot of that, of course. It's not necessarily a cause and effect thing, but it really is. It becomes a component of quantity of drugs that are used, and then how long they're used over time. And then, of course, there's that inter-individual variability where you have some individuals who can do a little bit of a drug and respond very well. You have other individuals who need a lot of drug to get the same response. And then you also have those individuals who can do a little bit of a drug and have no side effects, or they can do a lot of a drug and have no side effects or minimal side effects. So it really depends on the individual. But I really think when we see what is happening in the world today, I mean, like just yesterday or the day before, I read that a 26-year-old bodybuilder died in Brazil of a heart attack right after competition. And you see some of these stories. I mean, there's been a lot of bodybuilders dying relatively young in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. A lot of them were enhanced bodybuilders. Actually, pretty much all of them have been enhanced bodybuilders. And again, it's not necessarily a cause and effect, but there is, again, just the quantities of drugs that some of these people are doing, and they're not necessarily looking at their health biomarkers over time. And some of the protocols that are being used and prescribed today are pretty scary. And I think that's where we see some of these shorter lifespans.
I mentioned that to say most of the people listening to my podcast will probably be general population and advanced lifters, but probably not as many bodybuilders. And, you know, that's just a reminder for people about anything that you take to an extreme has this potential where you're hovering a line of being the greatest and potential injury. And, you know, so you can still lift. You can still use some of these advanced principles. You can still focus on muscle building, but without having to necessarily go to an extreme. And, you know, so when people hear these things and they might get scared, or they might say, oh, you know, see, that's why I don't lift, because, you know, it's like, well, no, lifting is going to improve your life. Having muscle is going to improve your life, especially as you age. And yeah, sure, if you want to take something to an extreme, and that person knows exactly what they're doing, you know, they're competing in a sport and they're trying to be the best. That's their goal. Their goal is not to be the healthiest. So, you know, that's not to shy people away from lifting. And, you know, just hearing some of those stories, I hope it doesn't discourage people, because, you know, I did a whole episode with Alan Argon on, you know, nutrition, but we talked a lot about protein. And one of the things he said was muscle on the bones like money in the bank. And I agree with that, you know, especially as we age. So, yeah, I just wanted to hear your input on that, or maybe any other words you might want to share, but I just wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point that you're bringing, and again, to highlight, you know, anything that you do to an extreme is gonna, you know, have a higher risk to reward ratio, and I don't think whether it's not just bodybuilding, but I mean elite cyclists, elite golfers, elite tennis players, elite anybody that's the best in the world. I mean, their whole life is dedicated to that particular sport, and you know, of course they're going to have you know, aches and pains and injuries, because they're doing things over and over again in very high levels, and their goal is not necessarily to be pain-free or injury-free. Their goal is to be the best in the world at whatever their craft is. So they're willing to take those risks, absolutely. But for the average person, yeah, absolutely, they don't have to worry about it. And in fact, most people, you know, I've heard this so many. It's like, well, you know, I don't want to lift because I don't want to get too big. I'm like, don't worry, you won't.
Right.
So
my father says the classic, like Arnold quote, where the guy says something like, oh, I'll never want to look like you. And it's the same thing. Like he replied with something like, don't worry, you never will. You know, same kind of stuff. But yeah, you know, I just think it's an important point to make. And that's also no knock to bodybuilders or anybody who wants to go elite as well. You know, if that's the way your brain is wired, if that's the way you feel fulfilled in life, if that's the way that you want to, you know, spend your life, and that's what you want to do, this is no comparison to say one is better than the other. I would much rather myself die doing what I love, and if that means I'm doing what I love, right, than spending a whole life healthy where I don't get to do those things. So no knock to either end, just making that point. Yeah. And so, you know, we're closing out here. Not that you have to have any final words, but is there anything else maybe we didn't touch on, or any last things that you want to share?
No, I just wanted to say, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here today. It was nice that we were able to meet at the NSCA conference and be able to chat. And again, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your expertise. And as soon as I watched your session at the NSCA conference, I said, yeah, this is it right here. You're very knowledgeable. You got your stuff. I also love that you practice what you preach. I have a bias in that realm. People who research these topics, but then also practice in these topics or coach in these topics. And it's very clear you're a bodybuilder as well, if I'm not mistaken, and work with bodybuilders. So I love that you practice what you preach and you're feeling this stuff firsthand. So thank you for your wisdom today. Thank you for your expertise.